want to begin today in talking about a changing look at worship. We're going to be looking at three different passages, Romans 1, Genesis 3:4, and of course from Job, where God speaks to Job. Everyone is a worshiper. I don't care who you are, whether you're a believer or not a believer and follower of Jesus. Every human being is a worshiper. The question is, what do you worship? That's the question. We're going to look at the first chapter, part of the first chapter of the book of Romans. It speaks of God's wrath against sinful humanity. How do you get there under God's wrath? The wrath of God is being revealed from heaven against all the godlessness and wickedness of people who suppress the truth by their wickedness. Since what may be known about God is plain to them, because God has made it plain to them. For since the creation of the world, God's invisible qualities, His eternal power and divine nature, have been clearly seen, being understood by what has been made, so that people are without excuse. For although they knew God, they neither glorified Him as God nor gave thanks to Him. But their thinking became futile, and foolish hearts were darkened. Although they claimed to be wise, they became fools and exchanged the glory of the immortal God for images made to look like mortal human beings, and birds, and animals, and reptiles. Therefore God gave them over to their sinful desires, and their hearts to sexual impurity for the degrading of their bodies with one another. They exchanged the truth about God for a lie. And they worshiped and served the created things rather than the Creator, who is forever praised. Amen. There's certain things that Paul is trying to get across to them, and one of them is this: that the wrath of God is on those who refuse to acknowledge God even after the evidence is in front of them. You know people like that? Even though people can look at creation and what God has made, and the evidence is right there that God created it. And yet when the evidence is right in front of them, they refuse to acknowledge God. The thing is that it's on those individuals that the wrath of God is coming, because they refuse to acknowledge God even when evidence is present. The second thing is this: that God's power in nature can be known by what He has created, which means, as Paul would say, they're without excuse. The possibility of knowing God by what He has created is an awesome thought. You can look at the universe, you can look at God, you can look at these things that He's created. And through those, a person can come to know that God is present, that this eternal God. It's kind of funny, just the other day, there was a report that came out that said, there's no such thing as the Big Bang anymore. You know what they replaced the Big Bang theory with? That all matter is eternal. It's been there all the time. And yet, in reality is that something has to be eternal in order for us to be here. Whether matter is forever, it doesn't really answer the question. You still have to have an uncaused cause. You still have to have something to begin with. It's either God who is eternal or matter itself. Those individuals are without excuse, because God can be known by the things that He's created. Thirdly, those who say they know God and are functional atheists are futile and foolish because they deliberately turn their backs on him. Functional atheists. Maybe some of us actually work that way. What's an atheist? An atheist is one who says they don't believe in God, right? That God exists at all. No such thing. But sometimes what happens is that we can profess to know God and we live our life functionally as if God doesn't exist. Functional atheists. We profess God to be there. Yeah, he's all wise. We know he's there. And yet it has nothing to do with our life as it is. Quite frankly, we become functional atheists. We live our life as if there isn't a God. And such is the case. How does that work out? There's some things that Paul says that this happens. The first thing he says that there's no gratefulness. They knew God, they confessed God, but they were neither thankful. They have no gratefulness to God. Secondly, there's empty claims. They profess themselves to be wise, but in reality they're really foolish because they're just talking. And it's empty. And the third thing it is for all mankind is this thing too. They exchange created things for Creator God. And they make something just like themselves. They exchange and replace the worship of God with the things they make, the things they create. They worship the things rather than the Creator who made them. The fourth thing is this. God brings passive judgment on sinful desires and impure actions. Passive judgment. Let me share with you what I mean by that. God says in this particular passage that he gives them over to their own lusts, their own desires. He just lets them go. We do this, don't we? Sometimes people like this where they refuse to acknowledge God, right? And they live their life as if God doesn't exist. They won't acknowledge him. They say, I don't need him. I don't need God in my life. I don't, over and over and over. And so the other things replace God in their life. They take the place of, and they begin to actually worship those things. I don't need God, the God who created all things. And they live their life that way. And God says, okay, you're going down that path? You're substituting other things for me? Keep going. Just keep going. Because he knows that it's going to end up in corruption. Their old soul, their old spirit's going to be corrupted. In the end, after they die, what happens? They stand before God and they go, God would say, well, you didn't need me or want me in your life. You don't need me now. That's it. So God allows passive judgment. He says, okay, you want to head that way without me? Keep going. Go ahead. You're going to head to corruption and loss. Number 5, they exchange the truth for the lie. In fact, that's the literal translation. Instead of exchanging the truth for a lie, literally it's the lie. The lie. Truth for the lie. Exchanging what you know. The lie. Well, where do you find that lie? Look with me. Believing the lie. We have people believing the lie, right? Genesis 3. You know the story. You know there was a time early on, Adam and Eve. Eve is at the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, and then there's the serpent, right? The serpent says some things to her. she's enticed to partake. This is what the serpent says to her. Verse 5, chapter 3. For God knows that when you eat from it, your eyes will be open and you will be like God, knowing good and evil. That's the lie, right? That's the lie that we chomp down on as if we can be our own God. We become God. We become the center. And that's what it's about. And mankind itself has believed that lie to such an extent that they exchanged the truth that God is God, that God created everything, that God gave us the breath that we breathe, and desires relationship. And exchange that whole thing for our own works of our hands because I become my own God. So mankind, according to the Apostle Paul, mankind has come to the place of exchanging what they know to be true and believing a lie. And that's really the work of Satan. I mentioned that. There's one place in the Scripture where Jesus talks about human dads being evil know how to give good gifts to their kids, their son. He says, well, your son comes to you and he asks for bread, you're going to give him bread, right? Not a stone. If he comes to you and asks for a fish, you're not going to give him a serpent or a snake. You're going to give him a fish. Such is what our Heavenly Father will do to those who would ask. But here's the rub. The rub is that what Satan would do, what Satan would want to get into that, is that we would ask for bread and we get the stone from him and he tries to convince us the stone is bread. That's what he tries to do. He'll give us the snake or the scorpion for fish, and he convinces us that the scorpion and the fish are actually fish. And we believe the lie. That we in ourselves, we can do it as long as, it's got to be it. This comes out in the Tower of Babel. Those of you that recognize that. The Tower of Babel. You know the story, right? You know what happened. The Tower of Babel, you have this situation. God had made this command. Be fruitful, multiply, fill up the earth. And if you know the story in chapter 11 of Genesis, we find this happening where everybody's speaking the same language. And they come around and they're gathered in one place. And they begin to build a tower. What's the tower? They say, wow, we build this tower. It's a gateway to heaven. We'll make it. We're going to do this. We can do this with the works of our hands. If you know the story at all, God comes down, sees what happens. He said, if this keeps up, there's nothing going to be held back from them. So he confounds the languages, and they actually end up doing what God told them to do, spreading out from all over the world because they are not able to speak to each other. And that tower crumbles. They were willing and wanting to worship, if you will, the works of their hands. The works of their hands. Instead of Creator God. In that relationship. And being obedient to what God had told him to do. Be fruitful, multiply, spread out. No. We can do it ourselves. Let's build a tower. We'll make it to heaven. Technology today can lead man to worship himself. technology. How many have a cell phone that you carry around? Isn't that amazing? Think about it. The thing that you hold in your hand, many, many years ago, when computers started, a computer took up several rooms, sometimes even a whole building. And what you hold in your hand today, isn't that awesome? It's everything that computer years ago could do and more. Isn't it awesome what man can do? Isn't that great? Now think about this. Another thing. How about this? How about this? You can come up, mankind can come up with a vaccine, right? A vaccine that can heal. And because of these vaccines or medicines, mankind can live longer today. Look what man can do. Isn't that awesome? And that's wonderful what man can do. Now, mankind can put a rocket in space that even go to the moon and back. That's amazing. But here's the problem. Those things, those creations, if you will, are only a shadow of our God who we worship. You see, what we do as human beings and all the wonderful things that we can come up with to make life easier, to prolong life, to do all these things are just a shadow of what God does and has done in creating the universe, creating things that, and given us the breath that we breathe. And so mankind begins to worship that created thing rather than Creator God and say, man, look what mankind can do. And all we are doing is expressing what God has put in mankind, His image. Make sense? And yet mankind ends up worshiping, if you will, the works of their hands, just like those that built that tower. It's about mankind worshiping the works of their hands. All substitute God, the one who created them. We're going to turn to Job 38. And some of you know the story yes, it is a story, but it's reality. Job was a real person. Jesus speaks of Job himself. James speaks about Job being, remember the patience of Job in the epistle of James. Job is a real person living around the time of the patriarchs like Abraham and Isaac and so forth. After the flood, Job is the oldest book in the Bible. Job's story opens up with Satan before God and saying, well, the only reason Job praises you or gives you thanks is because of what you have given him. You've protected him. You've given him wealth. You've given him family. And God says, okay, you can do something about that. Because Satan says, you take those away, and he'll curse you to your face. But you can't take his life. Go ahead. And so those things go away. His wealth, his family, his 10 kids are dead in one day. Even his wife got overwhelmed by that fact, goes to Job and says, why don't you just curse God? Just curse God and give up. die. So it didn't work for Job, because Job ended up saying, okay, I am holding on to my integrity. God gives, God takes away. Blessed be the name of the Lord. So that didn't work. The second thing that happened, his health goes away. Satan says, you take his health, skin for skin, take it away, and he'll curse you to your face. And God says, okay, go ahead, because you can't take his life. And so he gets boils on him from the bottom of his feet to the top of his head, and he's sitting out in a dump in the ashes. And he's scraping himself. Isn't that terrible? All right. That's bad, right? But he held on to his integrity and his relationship with God in the midst of it. But on top of that, he ends up with 3 friends who try to accuse him. The reason why this is all happening to him is because he blew it, he sinned, he did some things. And they go through several cycles of these 3 guys trying to accuse him and say, the reason this has happened to you is because this, and this, and this, and you've sinned, you've done something wrong, and God is judging you. But Job had a clear conscience. And the only thing, he did get depressed through it all. And sometimes he would say such things as I don't know about why I was even born. You know, I'm going through this stuff. And I wish I could stand before God and I could ask him why. And he would answer me. I need a mediator. And then God breaks in. Chapter 38. And God begins to ask Job some questions. And God doesn't answer the question why this is happening. But God reveals himself to Job by asking him questions. Let's look at some of those questions as we go through chapter 38. Verses 4 to 7. Here's the first section. Do you know the secrets of creation of the world? God would say, where were you when I laid the foundation of the world? Tell me how it was done, if you know. Next one, verses 8 to 11. Do you know the boundaries of the sea? Do you know the boundaries of the sea? How'd that happen? How did that happen that there's just the right amount of water on this planet to keep it cool and warm and enough land for us to live on as human beings? How did that happen? Hello, Job, if you know. Next, verses 19 to 24. Do you comprehend the nature of light and darkness in the sky? In other words, he says, Job, you know about light. Where does it start? Where does light begin? There's light everywhere in the universe. Where was the point in which it started? Tell me, Job, if you can. Tell me. Who has done that? Verses 25 to 30. Do you understand the nature of rain and its effects? He talks about, in this point, he talks about the fact that there's this cycle that goes on. And some of you know this from science, right? Evaporation, condensation, rain. He also talks about in this question about, do you understand what lightning is? He talks about lightning and thunder and the rain, and how the rain would come down in the desert and still water that nobody even sees it happening. And when that rain comes down, it cuts through the desert and makes gullies. And Job, tell me how that's done. Who does that? Verses 31 to 33. Do you know the nature of constellations? I want to use this verse from Isaiah because I think it's one of the most greatest things. If God can name the stars, does he not know you and me? Isaiah says, "To whom will you compare me? Or who is my equal?" says the Holy One. "Lift up your eyes and look to the heavens. Who created all these? He brings forth the starry host one by one and calls forth each of them by name. Because of his great power and mighty strength, not one of them is missing." Think about it, please. What Isaiah is saying, what God is saying there. The stars themselves, God knows them by name. None of everything is in their place the way God intended them to be. And it's not until we have something like the Hubble that can peer out and see nebula, that its color, the color of the nebula, it's been there all along. God created that, and yet it's not now, but we're just seeing those things that God had created. And we're beginning to see what God had made and has named and placed there. In this passage in chapter 38 of Job, he lists a number of, by name, nebula and stars, some of these constellations. He actually names them in Job 38. Let me just point these out, some of these. First one is the Pleiades. It has a name. We become to know that name is by the seven sisters. These stars are in the constellation of Taurus. It's among the nearest star cluster to the earth, and it is the cluster most obvious to the naked eye in the night sky. It's dominated by hot blue stars and very extremely luminous. God also mentions Orion in the passage in chapter 38. It's a constellation that includes familiar, prominent, bright stars, and particularly three of them that are in a row. And I don't know whether you can recognize that on the screen. There's three stars in the center. That's Orion's belt. Orion was named after Orion because Orion's the hunter, and it recognized as those three stars represent the belt, and God names that in Job 38, the oldest book of the Bible, thousands of years before we even had a telescope to see it. Another one is the Great Bear constellation that's mentioned there in 38. A very large constellation, Ursa Major, it's best known for a number of stars. You probably have heard of the Big Dipper. Well, the Bear constellation, the Big Dipper, is in that. You can see, I'm trying to mark it out there, the top part there, the Big Dipper, and the rest of it, it makes up this bear. Here's the fourth one that I think that God says to Job, can you put reins on this one? Can you steer it through the it's Arcturus. Arcturus. And I have that up here because I want you to see the speed in which this goes through, this star goes through the air. Through the space. 1.49 miles per second it turns. That's fast. That's fast. For light to get to Earth from this star, 37 years. 37 years. And God says, okay, Job, can you steer this thing through the sky, rains on it? Control it? Who does that, Job? Who does that? God continues to ask some questions, verses 34 to 38. Do you know the nature of clouds, weather, and the human mind? Verses 39 to 41. Do you understand and master the animal kingdom? All these things that I have created, I've done it. What's your answer, Job? Explain it. Job comes to the end, and he realizes that what God goes on to another whole full chapter of asking questions and making statements for Job to answer. Job speaks. In the last chapter, Job makes a statement that is about himself. And he says, God, I heard about you, but now I know you because I've seen you for myself. The God. So here's the question. And now I'm trying to get here very quickly here. And the question is do you know which God you're worshiping? Do you know who your God is? And I'm going to give you one concept that will tell you who your God is. Look at this. Your God is something that you will sacrifice to. Let me say it again. Your God is something you will sacrifice to. You see people sacrificing things? What are they sacrificing? And what are they sacrificing to? I believe there are gods in this modern times that have been sacrificed to that mankind has substituted the one who created them with. Let me share with you. The first one that I was thinking about is Bacchus. Bacchus is a Greek god. He is the god of wine and vegetation. But those that serve and replace Bacchus in their life with the God who created them end up where? Alcoholism. Alcoholism. And that type of addiction, and you could probably throw in other addictions as well, but the point is that here's the God of wine and whatever. And individuals are sacrificing to that God. And ends up in alcoholism. The next one, Epaphroditus. These are followers of Epaphroditus. And what does it mean? Love, beauty, desire, sexuality, and pleasure. That's what that God represents. And the bottom line to that, what comes out is any sexual depravity, but for many of us, pornography. What happens? The fulfillment. And what will people sacrifice in order to open that magazine, be on the computer? Pornography. And those that do that are sacrificing to this God. Sexuality, pleasure. Here's one that you're very familiar with, I'm sure. Mammon. The God of excess. The God of excess. Jesus talks about him, and you can't serve two. Actually, you either love the one or hate the other. You cannot serve God and money, mammon. It's a God of excess. And for many of us, not just in America, but around the world, materialism is the end. And what do I mean by materialism? It's I gotta have, I must have, I can't live without. Materialism. And what do you end up doing? I don't know about you, but I know what happens when that particular God is sacrificed. I get into so heavy debt. Because I gotta have, gotta want, can't live without. And you end up sacrificing many things to that God. Next one, Molech. Is a Canaanite fire god, and the way they were, this particular god would be a parent. In order to appease this god, a parent would lay their newborn or their child on this, not an altar, was literally what this god was. It was an iron or metal statue with its arms out, and that child, by the parents to appease this god, would lay that child in the arms of that idol. But the idol would be burning red hot to appease this god. And you know, to appease this god today, children are being aborted. I won't go on. Next, Demeter or Persephone. You may know there's two different ones there, but they both relate to the same thing. And that is, you ever heard of Mother Nature or Mother Earth? Ever celebrated Earth Day? Or seen that commercial years ago about the butter or the margarine? You can't fool Mother Nature. The point is that what comes out with that is what is in modern times is environmentalism. And what I mean by that very clearly is what it allows for human beings to be lower than the animals. That which they were to have dominion over. The environmentalism brings about to the extent that they will sacrifice money and time and every effort in order to save a whale, if you will, than making any effort to save a child. I don't know what you're sacrificing to. Do you? Do you realize? Because if it's any other God like this than the one who created you and me, if you're falling down that path, God says, okay, I'll give you up. Okay? Keep going. Go ahead. You're going to end in corruption. You're going to corrupt your soul and in the end be lost forever. These gods, every day, people are sacrificing to these gods. And they become number one. But it's only a replacement for the Creator who made them. Let's bow together in prayer.